Hello and welcome to the second video in the NEA series. In today's video, we're going to be covering AO2 and how to approach source analysis. So let's start then with a little bit of a recap of kind of what the exam board is looking for. So AO2, the best answers will give an excellent evaluation of a fully appropriate range of different sources that are primary and or contemporary to the period. The answer demonstrates the candidate's own full engagement with the sources using detailed and accurate knowledge in order to produce a well-supported analysis of them within their historical context. The key thing there is you should be giving quite a few different primary sources, and fundamentally, you shouldn't be just using them as evidence. You should be engaging with them and coming into justified conclusions as to how reliable and how useful they are in supporting your overall argument and judgment. Okay, if you do not engage with them, your answer is going to be in level 1 at the very bottom, where it says the answer has a very limited evaluation of at least 2 sources. So even if you have 10 primary sources, but you are not engaging with them, you're not telling me how useful they are, then there's no more marks than 1 out of 10. Okay, so it's all about engagement. AO2 is same with AO3 as well. Okay, so it's a quarter of your marks, and you must engage with the sources. So we recommend that you include at least 5, but closer to 10 would be ideal in terms of the number of primary sources. So that would mean if you are operating under like 4 or 5 different sections in your answer, you're looking at least, I would argue you should be aiming for 2 primary sources per section. Okay, so potentially 3 primary sources in some sections, but 2 as a minimum. Okay, and those should be quoted primary sources or paintings. Go ahead. You can also use those. To maximize your AO2 marks, you need to do the following things. You need to ensure an excellent range of primary source materials included, which I've just talked about. You then need to engage with and evaluate how useful that source material is in order to answer the question. Don't tell me how useful it is in and of itself. Because there's no such thing, right? You cannot say a source is biased in and of itself, okay? Let me give you an example. So if I was using a piece of Stalinist propaganda, some students might say, oh, it's biased because Stalin made it and therefore it's not reliable. Okay, full stop. That is not good enough, all right? Something only has inherent bias depending upon the question that you are asking. So, for example, that same source written by Stalin would be immensely useful if the question was assess Stalin's reasons for introducing the terror. That source, given that it was written by Stalin himself, would at least be somewhat useful, if not very useful. Okay, so do you see there that the utility of a source depends upon the question? So you must always, when you're evaluating a source, evaluate it in the context of the question. So is it actually helping you to understand more about the causes of the French Revolution or the causes of the terror and so on? And finally, your AO2 shouldn't be bolted on. It should be firmly part of your evidence throughout your paragraph. So please don't put it at the end of a paragraph. It should be something that's happening throughout your paragraphs and throughout all the sections in your answer. Now, I would pause and take a image or screenshot of what's on the screen now. This is the structure that I would recommend that you use. Okay, so source analysis is tough. Sometimes you can't cope. And that's exactly the structure. So content, own knowledge, provenance, and evaluation. And we're going to have a look at some models now. You'll see that the best model answers that the exam board released, the one that get 10 out of 10, use COPE for every single time a source is used. Okay, the candidates who don't get as high marks, so who get 1 or 2 out of 10, are not using this kind of structure, and you will see that in the answers. I will disagree with 1 or 2 of the exam board's decisions about the mark, and I'll explain why I slightly disagree. But overall, these I've picked an example for each level. So as you can see here, if we exclude the 0, we have 6 levels. We've got level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5, and level 6. So level 6 being the 9 to 10 out of 10. So assume that when you're reading it, that this candidate has used just sources like that and has analyzed sources just like that, okay, throughout the answer. So pause video and then we will talk through the first source. Okay, so the question that this candidate was answering was, assess the view that the Holocaust was a predetermined plan by the Nazi regime. The positive of this source is that they have actually quoted, so they've hit the content part, but that's basically all they've done. There's no own knowledge used to assess the validity of the source. So there's no context. There's no, where it says only such measures may be taken which do not jeopardize German life or property. There's no context as to what's happening there. They've not given any information about the time period. And furthermore, they've not considered the provenance of the source, except they've given these really simplistic, like year 7 level analysis of who has created the source. So they said it's from a leading Nazi, so Reinhard Heydrich. So therefore, it's biased because he is anti-Semitic. All right. There's no information about Reinhard Heydrich, no information about his views, and so on. I mean, for example, Reinhard Heydrich was one of them. Is the mastermind of the final solution. So the fact that they've not even considered that proves that this would be level 1 at best. Okay, it almost feels like they're doing a tick box activity. So it is reliable because it will be, or sorry, though it will be biased because he's anti-Semitic, it is typical because lots of other leaders plan to kill the Jews and is useful evidence. Okay, there's also very little attempt to link it back to this idea of the Holocaust being a predetermined plan. They don't actually prove it. They just say it is proof that there was a long-term plan, but there's no actual explanation of how this source proves that, because the source doesn't prove it. The fact that it's from 1938 means it cannot prove it, given that the Holocaust technically starts from some would argue 39 onwards, some would argue 41 onwards. Okay, have a look at the second one. Pause the video. Okay, so this one is a level 2. This one is level 2 with the potential to be much higher. What's letting the student down here is the lack of content. So they've not given any quotes or any information about this letter. So they've said the first record of Hitler's political activity is a letter, but give a quote. What is this letter? Where is this letter coming from? There's no, and that also filters through in terms of the provenance as well, because there's no context as to kind of there's no consideration of the provenance of the letter. So who was the letter sent to? All right. What do some of the words like elimination mean in the letter? All right. And there is some own knowledge, and that's why this isn't bottom level. Okay, pause video. Okay, so this one I haven't actually looked at myself fully, so I'm just going to remind myself. Okay, so this one we have some content. So there is a quote, although it's quite a minimal quote. And we do actually have a little bit of own knowledge where they've linked it to Albert Speer's claim that 80 million people were deprived of independent thought, and radio propaganda was an important means of achieving this. Notice how the question has changed as well, by the way. So it's not the same one. But here, what's lacking is there isn't enough provenance. So where the exam board says in their feedback, however, it is not dated or strongly contextualized, at what point in the regime was it produced, there's a lack of consideration of the provenance of the source. So the reason why this would get level 3 is because they do actually try and use their own knowledge, so Albert Speer, to kind of contextualize the source, but there's no consideration of provenance in any detail, and therefore it cannot go any higher. All right, so this is why COPE is so important, guys, because if this student had followed COPE, they would be getting way more marks. Okay, this one is a level 4 response, so have a pause, and then we'll talk through. Okay, so this one is an interesting one. I personally would have given it slightly higher. I would have potentially put it at the top end of level 4, bottom end of level 5. The exam board seems to put it a bit more in the middle of level 4. And that's just sometimes examiners disagree. So first things first is they give a good quote, and they also give the specific kind of information about where they've got the quote from. So we know it's a speech to the Nationalist Socialist League, Women's League, sorry, in 1934. What's also really nice about this is that they consider the provenance. So the fact that the speech was made to the Women's League, so Hitler may be obscuring the truth, telling women what they wanted to hear. And it's also used some own knowledge, which says he knew that women's support was imperative to success, and so on. Okay. There's 2 issues with this. First of all, the provenance and the own knowledge are just not detailed and not specific enough. So let me just show you how this answer could have been improved. So first of all, where it says this speech was made to the National Socialist Women's League, there needs to be more there. So they need to be thinking about the context as to what was happening at the time, which meant that Hitler was giving this speech. Okay, so 1934, early on, in Nazi rule. What's the context behind that? They need to go further with that. And furthermore, there's like a vague comment. So he knew that women's support was imperative to success. Are there any statistics to back that up? Okay. Is there anything that he could mention? So he could mention, for example, the League of German Maidens. I'm sorry, I'm assuming it's a he. They could mention the League of German Maidens and the role of Gertrude von Scholzkling, for example, but there's no mention of that. And furthermore, they then kind of make generalizations. So the bit at the end where it says a recorded speech cannot be edited, so it is likely to capture his exact meaning. They're on the right lines there, but they're kind of totalizing it. So sometimes speeches can be edited after they've been recorded before they are sent out or before they are used on the radio. So I'm not sure exactly in terms of the speech and kind of whether that would be applicable here, but that's a little bit of a simplistic and totalizing judgment. But overall, this is a good example of evaluation. So they're trying to do everything in COPE, but they're just not detailed enough and they're not going far enough. And you'll see in the next two examples of candidates who are going much further. So the next one is level 5. So we're now getting into the real kind of high mark. So have a pause and then have a little read. Okay, so this answer, I would say is good across the board. Now, the example says at the bottom, it says it might be possible to develop the origin rather more, but this is very good by dint of using both provenance and context and linking the analysis to the issue directly. So essentially, this candidate has ticked all the boxes. They just needed to go a little bit more in terms of depth. And you can see that it's actually quite short. Like the previous paragraph is actually longer. So what they needed to do is do a little bit more in terms of depth. So, for example, so they consider the fact that this does not necessarily prove that Nazi policies were successful in promoting this view. The author was a member of the National Socialist Women's League, an active supporter of the party. Her book was produced as part of an official drive to enforce Nazi ideology, so its aim must be taken into account. That's all very well and good, but the best answers, the students who get full marks will go even further. So we've got a kind of vague statements about the fact that the author was a member of the party and part of the Women's League and was produced to enforce, and the book was produced to enforce Nazi ideology. But that's kind of general sweeping statements that I could make about that source without even having read it pretty much. So what the example are looking for is just super depth. So really going into who the author of the source is when you're considering provenance, really going into their backstory as well. And then also there is some use of context. So reduction in income tax proportionate to the amount of children and measures to boost the birth rate. How much was income tax reduced by? Okay. And how much were they trying to boost the birth rate by? Okay. It's just that extra step, which this candidate could have easily done if they'd done a little bit more prep, and then they would have got themselves full marks on AO2. And then finally, pause the video. This is a level 6 AO2 example. Okay, so this is perfection across the board. We've got a really clear bit of content. So we get a little bit of background. So 1934, Hermann Göring wrote an account. There's a really decent quote. So it's like a quote which is relevant and it's quite detailed. So content, they're hitting all the marks. Look at the own knowledge, guys. Look how specific it is. 225,000 people were convicted. Almost 70,000 found in Dusseldorf between 1933 and 1939. So they're using specific dates and numbers, and they're also using KPD, SPD, NMEs. 59 of 679 cases. Okay, 200. All numbers, really, really specific in terms of their own knowledge. And then in terms of the provenance, where it says Göring claims perhaps to boost his own position in a notoriously competitive context of Nazi infighting can be challenged. In Dusseldorf, there were changes. So there is consideration there. I would argue that they could have taken the provenance even further. So I wouldn't have given this full marks for AO2. I would have given this like a 9 out of 10. I think they could have done it a little bit more in terms of the provenance. They've done so much on context. Although actually, they do actually have a bit earlier where they said the sheer violence of the SA whom Göring enrolled as auxiliaries. That bit would also apply. So I think they could have potentially taken the provenance even a little bit further. So really kind of going into scrutiny and as to kind of how Göring was trying to boost his own position. How was it a notoriously competitive context? All right. So with your source analysis, you don't want to overdo it. Don't start trying to do 15 to 20 primary sources. You won't get any marks for that. What you want to do is keep it between 5 and 10. 10 would be the dream, but keep it between 5 and 10 primary sources and do it in sheer depth and sheer detail. Look how much detail this student has done. They only would need to do this 4 more times and they're going to be getting a 9 or a 10 out of 10. Okay. Instead of doing loads of primary sources. It's very much quality over quantity, AO2. Now, some of you have been asking me where to get primary sources. It is tricky, but Miss has put together a source and interpretation booklet for you, so you need to be using that. Look for the ones with a green color circle next to it. There are source books that we have in the department, so you can come and borrow those. If you find a source quoted in a historian's book, you can use that, and that counts as AO2. So, for example, this quote by Hermann Göring, that is very likely just taken from a historian's book, okay? And historian's books, there's thousands of books written on the French Revolution or whatever, on the French Revolution, the different aspects of it. So you should be trying to consult historians' books for a lot of your primary sources. There's some sources released online, especially pictorial sources, and you can also find a lot of primary sources online in terms of on websites as well. Okay, so have a look, and if you are still struggling, then by all means you can come and speak to one of us. But it's just about trying to find your primary sources and then really drilling down into who the author is, what the context was at the time, think about the year, think about when it was made, why was it made, what's the purpose of the source, think about what was the broader environment, and so on. If you're thinking about all those different things, then you should be getting all the marks. In terms of a checklist, I haven't actually put a checklist on here, but you should be looking at your analysis of primary sources and you should be thinking the following things. Have I included, sorry, is my primary source relevant to the question? Okay, if it's not, then you can get no marks. Have I included a detailed quote from the primary source? Have I used specific and relevant own knowledge to unpick and evaluate the primary source? Have I considered the provenance by considering who's created the source, when they made it, why they made it, what type of source it is, and so on? You don't need to answer all of those, just answer a couple of them. And then finally, have you then clearly evaluated and linked back to the question and said how useful the source is in your inquiry when it comes to this question? Okay, so I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you all in the next video.